The coffee hit one's uniform before he even realized the cup was tipping. The brown liquid spread across his chest like a map of his failures. Around him, other soldiers stared for a moment, then looked away. Nobody had time for a clumsy cadet. Not today. "Everyone listen up." Lieutenant Jin's voice cut through the noise in the briefing room. She looked tired. They all looked tired. The fleet had arrived 3 days ago and nobody had slept much since. One tried to wipe the coffee stain with his hand, but that only made it worse. He gave up and focused on the holographic display floating above the table. Red dots showed where the alien forces were gathering. There were so many red dots. "The main enemy force is hitting our northern defensive line," Jin said. Her finger traced a line on the map. "That's where we're concentrating our troops. Command expects them to push hard through the industrial sector." One watched the map carefully. The northern line made sense. That's where the colony's main facilities were. That's where humans would defend hardest. That's where the aliens would attack. "We're stretched thin," Jin continued. "Really thin, so we need bodies on every possible approach, even the unlikely ones." She paused and looked around the room. Her eyes stopped on one. He knew that look. It was the look that said someone was about to get the bad assignment. "One," she said, "you're on the eastern approach. There's an old irrigation ditch that runs about 200 meters. I need you to watch it." Someone behind one laughed. The sound was quickly swallowed by silence, but everyone had heard it. "Ma'am," one said carefully, "the eastern approach, but the terrain reports show." "I know," Jin interrupted. She looked genuinely apologetic. "I know it's unlikely they'll come that way. The ground is rough, there's nothing strategic out there, and it's the long way around. But we need to cover every angle. Can you do this?" One stood, the coffee stain felt cold against his skin. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Supply officer will give you standard kit. Report to your position by 1800 hours." The briefing continued, but one wasn't really listening anymore. Other soldiers got assignments with squads with support with backup plans. He got a ditch, alone. After the briefing ended, soldiers filed out quickly. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to prepare. One gathered his gear slowly. His tactical, his rifle, basic supplies. As he checked his equipment, another cadet named Ho walked past. "Try not to get too bored out there," Ho said with a smirk. "I hear ditches are pretty exciting." One didn't respond. He finished his check and headed for the supply depot. The supply officer, a corporal named One, seemed distracted when one arrived. "Name and position." "Cadet 1, Eastern Approach, Irrigation Ditch." One looked up from his tablet. "Wait, seriously, they're putting someone out there." "Apparently." One shook his head and started pulling supplies. Standard rations for 3 days, water purification tablets, ammunition, medical kit, emergency beacon. He paused. "Want some extra batteries. If you're really out there alone, might as well have something to do." "Sure, thanks." As one loaded the supplies, he said quietly, "Look, everyone knows this assignment is basically punishment detail. But keep your head down, stay alert, and you'll be fine. The real fight is up north." One nodded and took his supplies. The walk to the eastern sector took 40 minutes. With each step, the sounds of the main base grew quieter. Ahead, the landscape turned rough and empty. Rocky hills covered in scrub brush. Abandoned mining equipment scattered like toys. And cutting through it all, a long, dry irrigation ditch. It was uglier than he expected. One stood at the edge of the ditch and looked around. The position was completely isolated. No other defensive positions visible. No support. No backup. Just him, a ditch, and a whole lot of nothing. He could see why command thought this place didn't matter. The terrain was harsh. Any attacking force would have to work hard to move through here. Why bother when there were easier routes? But one had studied military history at the academy. Before he barely passed combat training, he had been top of his class in tactical engineering. and something about this position bothered him. He pulled out his and brought up the terrain analysis. The ditch was deep, maybe 3 meters in most places. It ran in a fairly straight line from the eastern hills toward the main colony. Rocky ridges on both sides created natural choke points. Old mining equipment scattered everywhere. Then he pulled up the latest intelligence reports on tactics. They favored flanking maneuvers. They were good at finding weak points in defenses. They used speed and surprise. One looked at the ditch again, a weak point in the human defense, lightly guarded, a straight route to the colony's rear positions. "Oh," he said quietly to himself, "this isn't a useless position. This is bait." The sun was getting lower. In the distance toward the north, he could hear the occasional boom of artillery. The real battle was starting. Everyone's attention was going there, including command's attention. Which meant if they sent a flanking force through here, nobody would know until it was too late. One set down his pack and started walking the length of the ditch. He studied every meter, the rocky outcrops that could provide cover, the sections where the ditch narrowed, the places where old equipment could be moved or repositioned. His mind started working through possibilities. If an enemy force came through here, how would they move? Where would they be vulnerable? What could one soldier with limited supplies do to slow them down? By the time the sun touched the horizon, one had made his decision. He wasn't going to just watch this ditch. He was going to turn it into something else entirely. He pulled off his coffee-stained uniform jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Then he started to work. There was old mining cable nearby, some empty fuel drums, broken equipment that could still be useful if positioned correctly. As night fell and explosions lit up the northern sky, one dug and built and positioned. His hands got dirty. His back started to ache, but slowly the ditch was changing. Nobody was watching him. Nobody cared what the coffee-stained cadet was doing out in the forgotten eastern sector. That was their mistake. The night was cold, but one barely noticed. His hands moved automatically now, guided by years of engineering training that most people thought was useless for a combat soldier. They were wrong. He had been working for 6 hours straight. The ditch looked completely different now. One had started with the mining cable. There was almost 50 meters of it, thick and strong. He strung it across the ditch at ankle height in 3 different locations, hidden under a thin layer of dirt and rocks. Anyone running through in the dark would trip, and when they fell, they would fall exactly where he wanted them. The fuel drums came next, 5 of them, still half full of industrial fuel. He positioned them at key points along the ditch and ran simple fuses between them. Not sophisticated, but it would work. One spark in the right place, and this whole section would light up. The old mining equipment was the hardest part. A broken drill assembly weighing maybe 200 kilos. One spent an hour using a lever system to position it on an unstable rocky ledge overlooking a narrow section of the ditch. He rigged it with more cable. One pull, and gravity would do the rest. But the real trick was the reflective panels. He found them in an abandoned surveyor's kit near some old equipment. The panels were designed to mark survey positions, but one had a different use for them. He positioned them carefully on the ridges above the ditch, angled to catch and reflect heat signatures. To any thermal scanner, it would look like there were multiple warm bodies up there. Multiple soldiers. By 300 hours, one's position had transformed. What looked like a simple ditch was now a series of connected traps, each one designed to channel an enemy force into a smaller and smaller killing zone, each one giving him an advantage against superior numbers. He pulled out his and tried to reach command. The northern battle was getting intense. He could hear it even from here, kilometers away. The radio channels were chaos. Finally, someone answered. "This is rear communications, Private Bin speaking. This is Cadet 1, position eastern approach. I need to report defensive preparations at." Look, I've got 17 casualty reports waiting for processing, Bin interrupted. She sounded exhausted. If you're not actively under attack, it'll have to wait. Check in again at 600. But I need to. The line went dead. One stared at his. He understood. Bin was probably dealing with real emergencies. Compared to soldiers actually fighting and dying, one cadet reporting from a quiet sector wasn't a priority. He settled into a position he had prepared on the northern ridge overlooking the ditch. From here, he could see almost the entire length of his prepared zone. He had a good firing angle, cover behind rocks, easy routes to fall back to secondary positions. He ate a ration bar and drank some water. The coffee in his thermos was terrible, but it was warm. He sipped it slowly and watched his motion sensors. The sensors were basic equipment, nothing fancy. But he had positioned them at the eastern end of the ditch, where anyone approaching from that direction would trip them first. It would give him maybe 60 seconds of warning. Not much, but better than nothing. At 3:47 hours, the first sensor pinged. One's heart jumped. He put down his coffee and picked up his rifle. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was equipment malfunction. Maybe. The second sensor pinged, then the third. Something was coming. Multiple contacts moving in formation. He activated his tactical display. The sensor data was crude, but it showed at least 50 contacts, probably more, moving fast and organized, coming straight toward the ditch. This wasn't random. This was a military unit. One's hands were shaking. He had trained for combat, sure. Every soldier trained. But training and reality were different things. He was one person with one rifle and a handful of improvised traps, and a whole enemy unit was about to walk into his sector. He could run. There was still time to fall back to the main base. Let command know what was coming. Nobody would blame him. He was just one cadet. But if he ran, that enemy unit would have a clear path to attack the human rear positions. Soldiers who were already exhausted from fighting up north. They would be caught by surprise. People would die. One took a deep breath and activated his helmet camera. If nothing else, command would have a record of what happened here. Then he opened the communications channel again. Bin answered immediately, sounding even more stressed than before. I told you. Eastern approach is compromised, one said quietly. Enemy force approximately 200 strong moving through my sector. If I don't check in by 600 hours, mark this position as danger close and to enemy. There was a long pause. Wait, what? Are you serious? Yes, sending sensor data now. He transmitted the readings. They're using the ditch as an approach route. Tell Lieutenant Jin I'm sorry about the coffee stain. He closed the channel before Bin could respond. The eastern end of the ditch was dark, but his sensors showed the contacts were getting closer. Any minute now, they would enter his prepared zone. One checked his rifle one more time. 40 rounds in the magazine, 4 grenades on his belt, medical kit, emergency beacon, not much against 200 alien soldiers. But he had something else. He had terrain, preparation, and the element of surprise. He had turned this ditch into something designed to kill. He thought about his instructors at the academy, the ones who said he would never make a good soldier because he was too slow in combat drills, the ones who saw his engineering scores and said it was a waste, that engineers stayed in the rear, that real soldiers fought on the front lines. Well, now the front line had come to him. The first shapes appeared at the eastern end of the ditch. Even in the darkness, one could see they were big. Warriors stood almost 2.5 meters tall, with thick armor and heavy weapons. They moved in a tactical formation, professional and careful. They were going to come right through his position. One settled his rifle into his shoulder and watched through his scope. His finger rested gently on the trigger. Not yet. Let them get deeper into the trap. Let them commit. More warriors entered the ditch. 10, 20, 50. They were confident, moving at a steady pace. Why wouldn't they be confident? Their intelligence had probably told them this sector was lightly defended, maybe not defended at all. One waited until almost 100 warriors were strung out along the ditch, right where he wanted them. Then he targeted the lead fuel drum and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The first shot sparked off rock. The second shot hit the drum. The explosion lit up the night like a small sun. Fire spread instantly along the fuel line one had prepared, igniting the other drums in sequence. Walls of flame erupted across the ditch, splitting the formation into confused segments. Warriors screamed, some in pain, some in shock, some in anger. And one started to work. The fire created chaos instantly. The formation broke apart as warriors scattered away from the flames. Some tried to push forward. Some tried to retreat. All of them were confused. One didn't give them time to reorganize. He fired into the group on the western side of the fire, the ones cut off from their main force. His shots were careful and deliberate. One shot, one target, just like training, except these targets shot back. Energy bolts hissed through the air around him. The had located his muzzle flash. One dropped behind his rock cover as heavy weapons fire chewed up the ground where he had just been standing. Stone chips flew everywhere. One cut his cheek. But he had already planned for this. He scrambled backward along his prepared route, moving to his second firing position 30 meters south. They were still shooting at where he used to be. From his new position, one had a different angle. He could see the warriors who had made it past the first fire barrier. They were regrouping, forming up to push through. Their commander was shouting orders in a harsh, clicking language. One pulled the cable he had rigged earlier. The heavy drill assembly tipped off its ledge. 200 kilos of metal fell and crashed into the narrow section of the ditch. 3 warriors went down under the impact. The others scattered again. Now they knew this wasn't just fire and bad luck. Someone was actively fighting them. Someone had prepared this position. A squad leader barked orders, and 5 warriors started climbing out of the ditch, trying to flank along the ridge. They were coming straight toward one's position. He let them get halfway up before he threw his first grenade. The explosion caught 2 of them. The others took cover and returned fire, but now they were pinned on the slope, exposed. One picked them off one by one. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. All those hours on the practice range suddenly mattered. But there were so many of them. For every that fell, 3 more pushed forward. They were starting to understand the layout now, starting to identify his firing positions. Their return fire was getting more accurate. A bolt of plasma energy hit the rock next to one's head. The heat was incredible. He felt his hair singe. He rolled away and moved again, this time to his third position. His tactical display showed the enemy force was spreading out, trying to flank him from multiple directions. They were adapting, learning. That was the problem with fighting professional soldiers instead of mindless drones. One reached his third position and immediately triggered his second trap. The hidden cables he had stretched across the ditch pulled tight as ran through them. Warriors stumbled and fell. Behind them, more warriors tripped over the fallen. The neat tactical advance turned into a confused mess. And one fired into that mess, not aiming for individual targets now, just firing into the mass of bodies. Each shot found something. The ditch had become exactly what he designed it to be, a killing zone. The commander was screaming now. One could hear the fury in that alien voice. They were supposed to be flanking the human defenses. This was supposed to be easy. Instead, they were being slaughtered in a ditch by an enemy they could barely see. More warriors tried to climb out. More grenades met them. One threw his second grenade, then his third. He was running low on explosives, but the psychological effect was worth it. Every explosion made them more cautious, more hesitant. A group of warriors tried to charge his position directly, 10 of them moving fast and firing constantly. One dropped 3 before they got close. Then his rifle clicked empty. No time to reload. He dropped the rifle and pulled his sidearm. The pistol felt tiny in his hand. The charging were huge, armored, and very close. One fired until the pistol was empty too. 6 rounds, 4 hits. 2 warriors went down. The others were almost on top of him. He grabbed his rifle again, slammed in a new magazine, and fired from the hip. The closest took 3 rounds to the chest and dropped. Another turned to bring his weapon around. One shot him in the faceplate. The warrior's helmet cracked and he fell backward. The remaining warriors from that group pulled back. They had expected to overrun one human soldier quickly. Instead, half their assault team was dead. One's hands were shaking now. Adrenaline made his whole body vibrate. He could feel wetness on his left arm. When he looked down, he saw blood. A plasma bolt had grazed him at some point. He hadn't even felt it happen. He pulled out his medical kit with clumsy fingers and sprayed wound sealant on the injury. It burned worse than the wound itself. Then he injected himself with a stimulant. The academy had taught that stims were dangerous, that you should save them for true emergencies. This qualified. The stim hit his system like lightning. Suddenly his hands were steady again. His vision sharpened. The shaking stopped. He knew this was temporary, knew he would crash hard later, but later didn't matter if he didn't survive now. They were regrouping again. They had pulled back to the eastern end of the ditch. One could see them through his scope, clustered in defensive positions. They were treating this like a fortified defensive position now, like he had a whole squad backing him up. Good, let them think that. He switched his tactical display to show their positions and started working out his next move. He had expended 2 grenades, used about half his ammunition. Most of his traps were already triggered. The fire barriers were starting to die down. And there were still over 100 warriors down there, maybe more. One drank from his water bottle and ate an energy bar. His body was running on chemicals and fear now. Every muscle ached. The wound on his arm throbbed. Another graze on his leg he hadn't noticed until now. Minor injuries, but they added up. They weren't advancing anymore. That was something. But they weren't retreating either. They were waiting, probably calling for orders, trying to figure out what they were up against. One checked the time. 5:12 hours. Almost 90 minutes since the fighting started. It felt like days. He opened his communication channel. Static. The northern battle must be interfering with signals. He tried again. More static. Then a brief moment of clarity. Eastern sector, respond. This is 1, he said quickly. Still holding position. Enemy force has taken heavy casualties but still combat effective. Need. Static drowned out the rest. The channel went dead. At least someone knew he was still alive. They were moving again, but this time they weren't advancing. They were falling back, pulling out of the ditch, retreating. One stared through his scope in disbelief. They were leaving. After all that fighting, they were just leaving. He fired a few shots at their retreat, but his heart wasn't in it. He was too exhausted, too stunned. They had attacked with overwhelming numbers and he had held them. One person with a rifle and some improvised traps and he had held them. The last disappeared from view. The ditch was suddenly quiet. No more weapons fire, no more shouting. Just the crackle of dying flames and the smell of burned fuel and scorched earth. One slumped against his rock cover. His rifle fell from numb fingers. The stim was wearing off. The crash was coming. Everything hurt. His vision was getting blurry. He looked at the ditch one more time. Bodies everywhere. Warriors scattered along 200 meters. The position had held. Against all logic and probability, the position had held. And then one passed out. Lieutenant Jin couldn't believe what Ben had told her. A major enemy force at the eastern approach. That was impossible. That sector was empty. There was nothing out there except one. The coffee-stained cadet she had sent to watch a ditch because she needed to put someone everywhere, even the pointless places. "Get me a transport and a squad," Jin snapped. "Now." The northern battle had wound down to scattered fighting. They had pulled back. Everyone assumed it was because human forces had fought them to a standstill. But what if it was something else? What if they pulled back because their flanking force had failed? The transport bounced over rough terrain toward the eastern sector. Jin sat tensely next to 5 soldiers from her platoon. Nobody spoke. They were all thinking the same thing. One cadet couldn't possibly have held against a major enemy force. They were probably heading toward a massacre. As they approached the ditch, Jin saw smoke rising. Lots of smoke. The transport slowed down and the driver's voice came over the intercom. "Lieutenant, you need to see this." Jin jumped out before the transport fully stopped. The morning sun was just coming up, casting long shadows across the ditch. And in that light, she saw the battlefield. Bodies, dozens of them. Warriors scattered along the entire length of the ditch. Scorch marks from explosions. Bullet impacts everywhere. Improvised defensive positions. Signs of a major engagement. "Holy hell," someone whispered behind her. Jin walked slowly along the ridge. Her military training cataloged what she was seeing: overlapping fields of fire, channeled approach routes, trap positions. This wasn't random. Someone had designed this. Someone had turned a simple ditch into a death trap. "Ma'am," one of her soldiers was waving from the northern ridge. "I found him." Jin ran. One was slumped against a rock, his rifle beside him. His uniform was filthy and blood-stained. For one terrible moment, she thought he was dead. Then he moaned softly. "Medic," Jin shouted, "get over here now." Corporal rushed over with his medical kit. He checked one's vitals quickly. "He's alive. Multiple injuries, blood loss, stimulant crash, but he'll make it." Relief flooded through Jin. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been. "Can you stabilize him here?" "Give me 5 minutes." Was already working, cleaning wounds and applying proper bandages. He did field treatment on himself, kept himself alive. While worked, Jin looked around the position. Empty magazines scattered everywhere. Grenade pins, shell casings, and a thermos lying on its side, coffee spilled on the ground. "Lieutenant," one of her soldiers called. He was looking at his tactical scanner. "I'm reading over 180 casualties in this sector. 180. Jin stared at him. "That can't be right, check again." "Already did, 3 times. The soldier looked pale. "Ma'am, one person did this. One person held this entire position and killed nearly 200 enemy soldiers." By the time they got one back to base, word had already spread. Soldiers lined the path to the medical center, watching silently as the stretcher passed. Nobody laughed. Nobody smirked. They just watched. Colonel Ho was waiting at the medical center. He was a hard man, a veteran of 3 wars, and he didn't show emotion easily. But when he saw one being carried in, something flickered across his face. "How bad?" he asked. "He'll recover. Needs rest and treatment, but he'll be fine." "Good," Ho turned to Jin. "Lieutenant, I need your report, all of it." They went to his office. Jin explained everything she could. The assignment, the position, the battle aftermath. Ho listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Show me the helmet camera footage," he finally said. They watched it together. The footage was shaky and sometimes unclear, but it showed enough. It showed one working through the night, building his defenses. It showed him standing alone against a force that should have crushed him. It showed impossible bravery and terrifying competence. When it ended, Ho sat back in his chair. "Get this to intelligence immediately. They need to analyze his tactics, and get me forensics from the battlefield. I want to know exactly what happened out there." Over the next several hours, the full picture emerged. The force had been a flanking unit, 200 strong, tasked with hitting human rear positions. They had chosen the eastern approach specifically because intelligence showed it was undefended. They had walked straight into one cadet who had transformed their route into a nightmare. Intelligence officers studied one's defensive setup. "It's actually brilliant," one of them said. "He used their own momentum against them. Every trap fed into the next one. Every position gave him an advantage. This is academy-level tactical engineering, but applied in real combat conditions." The forensics team found something else: captured communication equipment in the ditch. When they decoded it, they found frantic messages sent during the battle, messages reporting heavy defensive positions and multiple enemy combatants. They had never realized they were fighting one person. By mid-afternoon, a reporter had gotten wind of the story. Private Bin tried to keep it quiet, but too many people had seen the battlefield. Too many soldiers had heard what happened. The reporter wanted interviews, wanted photos, wanted to tell the story of the coffee-stained cadet who became a one-man army. But one was unconscious. The doctors said he would sleep for at least 12 hours. His body needed to recover. Jin sat outside the medical center. She felt guilty. She had sent him there because she needed someone everywhere, even the useless places. She had basically thrown him away, and he had saved them all. "Stop beating yourself up," said, sitting down next to her. "You gave him an assignment. He did something extraordinary with it. That's on him, not you." "I should have." "Should have what?" "Known a flanking force would come through there. Known he would turn that position into a fortress." Shook his head. "He saw something nobody else saw. That's why he's a hero." Inside the medical center, one started to wake up. His first thought was confusion. Why was he in a bed? Why did everything hurt? Why were there people standing around staring at him? Then he remembered the ditch, the battle, the... "Am I captured?" he asked groggily. A nurse smiled. "No, soldier, you're at base medical, you're safe." "The eastern approach." "Held," Colonel Ho said, stepping into view. "You held it, against odds that should have been impossible." One tried to sit up. Everything hurt worse when he moved. "The enemy force." "Retreated. Nearly 80% casualties. They're calling your position something in their language. Our translators say it means trench of ghosts. They think you had a whole platoon out there." One laid back down. "That was good. That was very good. I need to report." "You need to rest," Ho interrupted. "Your report can wait. Right now you recover." He paused. "Also, you're not a cadet anymore. Field promotion to sergeant effective immediately. Congratulations." "Sir, I don't." "Not a request. You earned it." Ho's expression softened slightly. "You did good, one, better than good. You saved a lot of lives last night." After Ho left, Jin came in. She looked like she hadn't slept. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what?" "For sending you there. For treating it like punishment detail. For not believing that position mattered." One shook his head. "You put me where I could make a difference. I just did my job." "No," Jin said. "You did something amazing, and we're all grateful." She stood to leave, but one called after her. "Lieutenant, do you think anyone saved my thermos? I'd like it back." Despite everything, Jin laughed. 3 weeks after the battle, the war was over. Not because humans had won some decisive victory, but because the requested negotiations. They said they wanted to avoid further bloodshed. Everyone knew the real reason. The Trench of Ghosts had changed everything. One sat in a classroom at the military academy, his arm still in a light brace. In front of him were 30 soldiers from various units. They were here to learn from him. It still felt strange. "The most important thing to understand," he said, pointing at the tactical display behind him, "is that every position can be made valuable, even the ones that seem worthless." One of the students raised her hand. "But Sergeant, the eastern approach was clearly vulnerable terrain. Command just didn't see it." "No," one corrected gently. "Command saw it exactly right. That terrain was harsh and offered no strategic value. That's why they only put one person there. What changed was that I decided to work with what I had instead of complaining about what I didn't have. He advanced the display, showing the breakdown of his defensive setup. Look at this. I didn't have mines, so I used cable as tripwires. I didn't have proper explosives, so I used fuel drums. I didn't have support, so I created the illusion of support with reflective panels. Every disadvantage can become an advantage if you think about it differently. The class took notes. Some looked inspired, others looked skeptical. One understood both reactions. After class, a young soldier approached him. Her name was, and one remembered her from his cadet days. She had been one of the ones who laughed when he got the ditch assignment. "Sergeant," she said formally, "I wanted to apologize for making fun of you, for not taking you seriously." "It's okay," one said. "Nobody took that position seriously. That was kind of the point." "Still, I was wrong, and I wanted you to know that I requested transfer to your training unit, if you'll have me." One smiled. "Of course, report Monday morning, bring work gloves." As left, Lieutenant Jin walked up. She had a tablet in her hand and a concerned expression. "We need to talk." They walked to a quiet corner of the training facility. Jin pulled up a file on her tablet. "Intelligence has been monitoring communications. You need to see this." The file showed transcripts of intercepted messages, military channels discussing human defensive capabilities, and right there in multiple reports was the same phrase, "Trench of Ghosts." "They're teaching it," Jin said. "In their military academies, the Battle of the Forgotten Ditch. They're using it as an example of why human positions should never be underestimated." One stared at the reports. "They're teaching about me. They're teaching about humans, about what we can do with limited resources, about our refusal to quit even when the situation looks hopeless." She scrolled through more files. "There's analysis here about human tactical engineering, human defensive psychology, human stubbornness. You became their case study for why this war was unwinnable." It was strange to think about. An alien species, light years away, studying his desperate defense of a ditch, learning from his fear and determination. "There's more," Jin continued. "Command is incorporating your methods into standard defensive doctrine. They're calling it the One Principles. Turn every position into a lethal one. Never waste terrain. Make the enemy pay for every meter." That seems like a lot of credit for just doing my job. "You didn't just do your job. You rewrote the job." Jin closed the tablet. "Morale across the entire defense force went up after word spread about what you did. Soldiers who were ready to give up found new determination. You showed everyone that individual soldiers still matter, even in modern warfare." Over the next months, one settled into his new role. He trained defensive tactics to hundreds of soldiers. Each class heard the story of the ditch. Each class learned the principles he had discovered that night. Turn disadvantage into advantage. Use the terrain. Think like an engineer. But he also made sure they understood the real lesson. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about glory. It was about doing your absolute best with whatever you had, wherever you were. The peace negotiations with the concluded successfully. Both sides agreed to establish boundaries and communication protocols. Human space would remain human. Space would remain. Trade would be allowed but closely monitored. At the treaty signing, the ambassador made an unexpected statement. "We came to this war believing humans were weak, disorganized, easy to defeat. We learned we were wrong. Your species has a quality we underestimated. You never accept defeat, even when defeat seems certain. You find ways to win that we cannot predict. For this reason, we believe peace is better than continued war." The ambassador never mentioned one by name, but everyone in the room knew what he was really talking about. 6 months after the battle, one received permission to visit the eastern sector again. The ditch had been preserved as a memorial site. not by command decision, but by the soldiers who had seen what happened there. They had placed markers along its length, 183 markers, one for each warrior who died there. One walked along the ridge where he had made his stand. Someone had cleaned up the position, but left the basic defensive structure intact. Future soldiers could visit and see how it had been done. At the northern end of the ditch, someone had placed a small monument, just a simple stone with an inscription. One soldier held this ground. Remember that one person in the right place can change everything. One stood there for a long time. He thought about that night. The fear, the determination, the desperate fight. He thought about the choice he had made not to run. The choice to stand and fight, even when fighting seemed pointless. He pulled a small package from his bag. Inside was a tiny coffee plant grown from seeds he had ordered. He dug a small hole near the monument and planted it carefully. Water, soil, gentle packing. Basic care for a growing thing. For remembering that even coffee-stained cadets can matter, he said quietly. As he turned to leave, he saw another group arriving. Soldiers on a training exercise coming to see the famous ditch. Their instructor was pointing out the defensive positions, explaining the tactics. One didn't approach them. This place wasn't about him anymore. It was about the idea, the principle, that every soldier in every position, no matter how small, had the power to make a difference. He walked back toward the base. Behind him, the coffee plant stood in the dirt near the monument. It would grow here, in this place where one person had refused to give up, where one person had turned a forgotten ditch into a legend. The war was over. Peace had been achieved, but the lesson remained. Humanity had shown the galaxy something important. They had shown that humans didn't win through superior technology or overwhelming force. They won through stubbornness, creativity, and the absolute refusal to accept the impossible. They won because when you put a human in an impossible situation with nothing but determination and a rifle, that human would find a way. They always did. That was the real meaning of the Trench of Ghosts. Not that one soldier had killed many enemies, but that when it mattered most, a human had stood their ground, had used everything they had turned weakness into strength. And in the end, that was enough. One looked back one last time at the ditch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the memorial markers. It looked peaceful now, quiet, a place where something terrible had happened but also something extraordinary. He smiled slightly and continued walking. There were more soldiers to train tomorrow, more lessons to teach, more people who needed to learn that they were stronger than they thought. The coffee-stained cadet was gone. In his place stood Sergeant One, defender of the Eastern approach, creator of the One Principles, and the soldier who taught an entire galaxy to respect human determination. And that was a pretty good trade for one night in a ditch.